It's just 11 o'clock and I don't want to waste Peter Marson's time. Given, I mean, the experience has been that many people come between the first 10, 15 minutes. If Peter wants me to wait a little bit, it's fine. If he wants to start, he can start with us.
How many participants are you expecting?
Well, the participants for the Entrepreneurial University course with the Institute of Development Studies is, they are actually 113 participants. We expect less, of course, usually, because the course was partially asynchronous. So let us wait for something around, I cannot estimate, but people are joining, as we can see. We will start with Professor Peter Marson, and later on also we have one of our guest, Professor Mamo Muchi from South Africa, who would also be joining us after Professor Peter Marson leaves. So without much ado, I think there is no time to introduce. I see people from the Association of African Universities. I see people from the Institut de la Gouvernance Universitaire in the Institute of Higher Education Governance in Yaoundé. I see also one of Professor Peter Marson's former student, PhD student, Mr. Terence Yu, who joining us. There were also some people from Tampere who want to join to listen to Professor Peter Marson. Peter, do you want me to introduce you, or you can introduce yourself? But let me introduce you, please.
Go ahead.
Professor Peter Marson is a professor in higher education studies at the University of Oslo, Norway, an extraordinary professor at Stellenbosch University, South Africa, and fellow at the Steinhardt Institute for Higher Education Policy, New York University, United States of America. His main research interests are in the areas of governance of higher education and science. Before moving to Norway in 2000, he was acting director of the Center for Higher Education Policy Studies, University of Twente in the Netherlands. He has participated in many national and international expert committees and evaluation panels in higher education, and currently a member of the executive board of the Bharat Dew Music Academy in Oslo, and has produced over 200 international publications. I would like to say this is really very moderate of Professor Peter Marson. I am Dr. Do from the University of Turku, in the process of adjunct professor of higher education at the University of Turku. I would like to say that I'm proudly a product from Peter Marson among several international students, among several Africans that Peter has trained. I was one of his first students in 2005 when the Erasmus Mundus was launched. And I would like to say this is one of the best speakers you can listen to in higher education governance issues. Due to his very affectionate, his commitment to the teaching of higher education governance, his over 150 students. I don't know if Peter ever sat down to assess it. They call Peter Marson the Pope of higher education governance. So welcome, Peter, and we shall be listening to his talk on research collaboration between European and African universities. We consider this also a very important pathway in the discussions about entrepreneurial universities, because the platforms, European African platforms, are increasingly becoming important for reinforcing research capacity. Thank you very much and welcome, Peter.
Thank you very much, Pascal, for your kind introduction, but I can assure you there's only one Pope in the world and it isn't me. The presentation that I have for you, and I hope that I can share screen, that you allow me to use my PowerPoints. See my PowerPoints now?
We can see.
Okay. So I have a number of very good. I have a number of slides that I want to share with you, and there are a number of perspectives that I want to present that are relevant for a discussion about the notion of entrepreneurial university. And it's a notion that has been and still is very influential. But from my perspective, also based on my research and the interaction with students, with staff in universities, university leaders, associations, organizations, I think the broader context in which we have to discuss entrepreneurial university is the place of universities in society. And from that, we can see that around the world, in most countries, there's a discussion going on what kind of university do we want, for what kind of society. Here are just a few examples of universities that represent the old, the new, the modern, the traditional, the innovative, the conservative. And it also represents the very strong survival characteristics and traditions of universities that have been able to adapt to changes in society in many ways throughout its long history, which goes way back beyond the 1,000 years that is usually attached to the history of the university. So what we can see is that universities have a very strong institutional foundation. They have, on the one hand, a kind of defense against the invasion of alien norms. And they adapt effectively on the basis of their own understanding of what they are, what they can contribute to society, what are their core characteristics. They're able effectively to adapt to environmental changes and to new societal expectations. And what we can see over the last decades is that there are changing conditions for institutional governance, institutional organization, funding, based on the fact that there are many demands coming towards the university, many external, but also internal demands. And within this context of demand for change, what we see, of course, is that the traditional university missions, education and research, have massively grown and expanded. In education, we can see over the last 20, 25 years, a rapid continuous increase of student enrollment and development of all kinds of course profiles, growth amongst other things in the area of multidisciplinary courses. And this expansion isn't limited only to high-income countries, but we see more and more around the world, also in Africa, growing participation rates in higher education. And while Africa was traditionally lagging behind, we can see that many countries in Africa now show a rapid growth in student enrollment and the accompanying adaptation of course profiles, etc. Research is no longer the activity which can be characterized by either basic or applied. It's much more complicated. There are many partnerships in research. There are different types of knowledge production that we acknowledge. and we can see that many universities are not only active as traditional basic research institutions, but they've developed all kinds of ways of producing knowledge together with students, together with external partners, etc. And in this context of dramatic growth of education and research, we see key developments in society that universities are expected to respond to. The knowledge society notion, where accelerated change, technological, economic, social change, expects from universities that they contribute to innovation in society, especially innovation in the private sector. And this innovation emphasis is usually linked to the economic change, economic competitiveness of societies. But there are also the grand societal challenges, whatever way they're called, the wicked problems, which require different approaches, different responses from universities and other actors. We can think of many, just to name a few: climate change, inequality in society, security issues, global health, the current pandemic. How do universities respond to it, and how do they relate to society in their responses are key issues that universities have to handle. There's also the intensifying global science competition. The US, the EU, China, to some extent India, global science competition where also more and more countries or regions try to create special collaboration conditions and programs with Africa. And there's a growing need for lifelong learning. There's a growing awareness and acknowledgement that the traditional way of organizing higher education, students at a young age, 18, 19, taking a course, getting a degree, and then entering working life to never go back to the classroom is an outdated one. We have to also, from a university perspective, look at innovative ways to offer and develop lifelong learning activities. And all this is built around the notion of sharing knowledge. Universities are the knowledge institutions of our day and age. They've been knowledge institutions for a very long time, and they're more and more required to share their knowledge. And one response that has come out from various actors to this demand for sharing knowledge is the notion of creating entrepreneurial universities. I'm sure you know the work by Burton Clark, and look also at the subtitle, Organizational Pathways to Transformation. So this wasn't about entrepreneurial universities per se, his study. It was about how do you develop a transformation pathway in a university that is effective and that allows you to adapt in the way that is part of the university tradition. The key features of the entrepreneurial organization universities, as Clark called it, are these: diversifying university income, strengthening and steering capacity, extending developmental periphery, stimulated academic heartland, embracing the entrepreneurial culture. I'm sure you're all aware of this. And I was working at one of the universities that was a case study for Clark's research in the 1990s, the University of Twente in the Netherlands, and I helped him to organize his research and to analyze his data. And it's interesting that his work got so much attention and that it is one of the major inspirations for this current and continuing interest in entrepreneurial universities. At the same time that the entrepreneurial university as a concept emerged and got a lot of attention, we've seen this global reform agenda, the modernization agenda for higher education, where universities have to develop into organizational actors and become more executive in their leadership, implying that institutional leadership and management should become more professional instead of as amateurs into parties, take a leadership role for a shorter or longer time. Institutional autonomy should be accompanied by accountability. Universities should account for how they use their freedom. Funding base should be diversified from public to private funding, and increased competition, and all kinds of elements that are expected to be introduced, allowing universities to contribute more directly to economic competitiveness, to innovation, etc. So entrepreneurial university became attached to this agenda of the global narrative. But after 30 years of this agenda with the same kind of elements, professional leadership, entrepreneurial universities, more autonomy for universities, more diversified, meaning more private funding for universities, including high tuition fees, more contribution, more effective contribution to competitiveness. What does the current pandemic teach us? It teaches us that this narrative, which is also, as said, a narrative linked to the entrepreneurial university, has its disadvantages. And it also teaches us that we have to look for a different narrative, because this modernization narrative has not prepared the universities to deal adequately with this pandemic. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So is creating entrepreneurial universities an appropriate way to realize the transformation in higher education that our societies are asking for, are looking for? Clarke's study was criticized because it has an either-or approach, in the sense that Clarke assumed that only those universities that would be able to develop into entrepreneurial universities would be able to survive. Also, certainly in his book, he later nuanced it somewhat in articles, but he presented a one-size-fits-all model with these elements that I showed you should be the same in all entrepreneurial universities. In addition, this key aspect, diversified funding, meaning moving away from a large basic government grant, a public grant, plus some additional income, to a diversified funding model where funding is based on competition, success in competition, and a limited basic grant from the government. It's a disaster in the COVID-19 crisis. We see in countries that have taken this narrative furthest, the UK, Australia, the United States, many universities are in deep, deep trouble. The combined estimate of debt for British universities, for example, is anywhere between 30 and 60 billion pounds, depending on who you talk to, based amongst other things on the fact that their reliance on income from international students is heavily jeopardized. The same goes for Australian universities. So we have to rethink the way in which we, as universities, want to transform and want to relate effectively to society. What is also an interesting response is the universities that were in Clarke's study established a consortium, but they rejected the notion of entrepreneurial. Yes.
Sorry, Peter. Sorry, Peter.
Yes.
I was going to find out if you would like questions to be asked while you speak, or you just want to speak at once, whichever you want.
I don't understand your question. Can you repeat it?
I was going to find out if you can receive questions while in the talk. Or,
no, if there are any questions, I'm more than happy to address them. I don't have to wait to the end. Fine. So if there are any questions, just let me know.
Yes, Professor Peter Mason has given the floor to anybody who wants to ask a question to ask why he is speaking.
Yes, please. So you can do it either in the chat or through Pascal. Just let me know. So this last point was that the universities that were the case universities in Clarke's study in Europe, they set up a consortium and they called themselves innovative universities. On their website, they refer to the notion of entrepreneurialism, but not as an overall characterization of their university. They want to be innovative. And this also has to do with the following point. There's pressure for transformation, but in many of the government agendas, the emphasis is on the economic role of universities. Well, there's very little attention for the role of universities in developing a humanistic culture, social cohesion, solidarity, vivid public sphere, etc. So there are many roles the university traditionally has, which are neglected in the reforms and the demands for transformation. And they're extremely important also for the diverse role that universities play in society. So my take on it is that, yes, there is a need to look carefully at the relationship of university with society and to change and activate that relationship, but maybe not by emphasizing one model of an entrepreneurial university. Yeah, I want to go back to a notion of university as a multiversity, which has an entrepreneurial dimension potentially in it, but not as an overarching characterization. So traditionally, the university had two primary processes. Most universities were emphasizing education, and many had also a research mission. But in the view of many stakeholders in higher education, we have to move towards three equal missions. And there's been a lot of talk about this third mission and what it actually is. But there's a clear understanding that this third mission, next to education and research, isn't providing services to society, but it is about equal knowledge-based, mutually beneficial partnerships. So universities, also in their developing of their entrepreneurial activities, however they're defined, should not be flags in the wind that respond to any kind of direction the wind comes from, but they're expected to actively, proactively identify key partners, both public and private. There can be cultural actors, economic actors, political actors, and only with these key partners do they operationalize the notion of sharing knowledge. Now, in a research study that I've done the last years, which was commissioned by a German foundation and funded by this foundation, we looked at higher education institutions around the world, using the term universities for that, but it included also universities of applied sciences, colleges, etc. And our interest was to find out how universities themselves see their role in society and their place in society, and how they develop this relationship with society through a specific mission. The report is freely accessible. You can download it from the website of the German Foundation, The Place of Universities in Society. We included, amongst other things, South Africa and Chile and a number of other countries in here. And we looked at what universities themselves were doing here. So there's, of course, a broad acknowledgement within universities of the importance of the third mission and the need to further strengthen relationship with society. But universities are struggling with how to balance education, research, and this third mission, and how to use transfer achievement, so the sharing knowledge activity that they're doing. How can they do it more strategically, more structurally, moving from projects to sustainable, mutually beneficial partnerships? So how do you put the jigsaw puzzle pieces together? University one side as a knowledge institution, society on the other side, with many actors, small or larger, public, private, that are in desperate need of some knowledge sharing and knowledge relationship partnership with universities. In this, there's a fundamental difference between knowledge transfer and social engagement. There are other terms that can be used for it: technology transfer, community engagement. But on the one side, there are these transfer activities that are commercial, as well as transfer activities that are without commercial purposes. So these partnerships can have a direct economic, commercial purpose, role, focus, but they can also be aimed at strengthening civil society, developing partnership, for example, around inequality or healthcare or climate change. So when we look at knowledge transfer and social engagement, then we can see that in universities around the world, knowledge transfer is much better organized, much better managed. Its commercial dimension is clearly having an impact. It's also more strongly institutionalized. Many universities, colleges around the world have an office for knowledge transfer in one way or another, either within the university or, like in countries like Germany, it's placed outside the university in close partnership with one or more private companies. There are also a great variety in what the knowledge transfer practice means in university. There are even a large number of different terms used for it. But if we look at social engagement, we can see that it's weaker organized, weakly coupled to primary processes. We found very few examples of universities where students can get credit points for engagement activities, whether it's around one of the issues we mentioned or specific local issues. So there's still a very long way to go for universities to institutionalize and integrate their social engagement activities more structurally in their organization. So finally, some challenges. There's a need for professionalization of management, obviously, and how to organize this link to society within the university so that it can become equally important as education and research. There's also a need to scale up social engagement and broad knowledge transfer activities to involve more than the central administration, external actors, and a few selected academics or students. Usually in universities, this link to society is not carried by the whole university community. It is an activity and the responsibility of a happy few. At the same time, there's still in many universities an ivory tower image that we, for example, saw very strongly in Chile, where research-intensive universities are regarded as being decoupled from society. So universities also have to work on their mission and how they communicate. Any questions on this until now? I'm sorry?
Peter, maybe I can start with a question.
Sure.
You seem to have a bit of a more gloomy picture about how the entrepreneurial university that has evolved in the last 30 years would cope during situations like the COVID-19. On the other hand, on my part, I think that there are features of the entrepreneurial universities that are relevant. The first one I can talk about, even just the notion of diversified funding base. COVID-19 has questioned the funding basis of universities. Undertaking universities that are going to create, that are involved in the vaccine, the undertaking culture is an important element of an entrepreneurial university. I could name quite a lot of them, even opportunism. I would really like to find out what would be the main challenges. How do you sharpen the main challenges in general at the post-COVID-19?
Thank you, Pascal. First of all, I think we have a kind of a different take on entrepreneurial university. I'm very critical of the notion. For me, universities aren't either entrepreneurial or not entrepreneurial. For me, the notion of an entrepreneurial university has developed without a strong empirical basis. It's understandable. It's one of the ways in which, amongst other things from the academic community, but also from the university side itself, in which this need for transformation in the university has been attempted to operationalize. But for me, it's an outdated idea that a university as a whole should change and become entrepreneurial. I don't know any example, neither from the set of universities that Clark investigated, nor anywhere else in the world, of universities that are entrepreneurial in the sense of this notion of an entrepreneurial university. But I also know very few universities that have not developed entrepreneurial activities, but that doesn't make them entrepreneurial universities. So I take distance from this notion of an entrepreneurial university as an either-or model. That's my first point. Second, the COVID crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, and we're still in the middle So we see the first empirical studies done on how universities respond around the world. ARUA, the African Research University Alliance, has, for example, on its website, a report on how its member universities responded. We see that in the COVID-19 crisis, there are different elements that we can interpret for how universities will be positioned in society after the crisis. And we can see that in countries which have a very strong a large basic grant, a high level of public funding for the university, like, for example, in my country, Norway, or other European countries, East Asia, China is a good example. Universities are hardly affected in their basic financial economic situation compared to universities in Australia, the UK, the US, which are in a deep crisis. So that's one dimension. The other dimension is where I would link a vaccine inequality in the world. The vaccine inequality that we also see now in the COVID-19 crisis, where different parts of the world have different access to vaccines, and low-income countries in Africa and in other parts of the world have not the same access to vaccines as, for example, high-income countries in Europe, can be linked to scientific inequality. There have been fundamental underinvestments in universities in low-income countries, including in Africa. And one of the arguments that was used in the discussion in the World Trade Organization about the way in which the patent rights, etc., for vaccines should be handled, one of the responses was low-income countries do not have the capacity to produce and store the complex vaccines. And this has absolutely to do with the next point that I want to make, so I will elaborate a few of this. But the way in which universities in the north, and for example, one of the companies that has now produced one of the vaccines that has been approved in the EU has gotten 500 million euros from the EU, together with universities, to work on the production of the vaccine. Even in South Africa, there's not one university directly involved in the production of the vaccine. So there's a scientific inequality which has to be addressed in order also for universities in low-income countries in Africa and Asia and Latin America to contribute to the welfare of their society in a way that universities in our part of the world can do it. Okay? There was another question I saw. There was another question.
Thank you very much, Peter. Just one last question. I would say a little bit in French. Peut-être il y a des gens qui veulent poser leurs questions. Je suis disponible pour répondre. If there are French speakers here managing to listen to the lecture in English, so I ask that if they have questions, I can translate them. Peter, just my last question on this.
Oh, there was also another question from, I saw a hand at least in the audience.
Okay.
Yeah,
based nature.
Hello.
Okay.
Yeah. Hello. Thank you for the lecture. So I raised my hand earlier. My question is this: from Clark's research, from the research of Clark and the investigation on the universities, I saw, like in one of the slides, the idea was the universities that were assessed were more focused on being innovation universities rather than being entrepreneurial universities. I'm not quite clear if that was a submission. And if that is the case, I wanted to also know, like, to understand more what that meant to those universities, that they want to be focused more on innovation rather than being entrepreneurial universities.
That's it. Thank you very much for your question. The study of Clark was done in the 1990s, and Clark was assuming that as a consequence of the demand for transformation, universities were trying to adapt to changes in society. And he used the term entrepreneurial for the universities that he selected for his study. in the first round only in Europe, later on also in other parts of the world, including Africa. Makerere University, amongst others, was included in a study, as were universities in Asia and the US. He used the term entrepreneurial as a kind of comprehensive term covering these transformation dimensions that he discovered or that he identified, like the strong core, diversified funding, etc. The universities themselves very rarely use the notion of entrepreneurial. They could use it in certain ways, but different than Clark as a kind of transformation or model. That's the way in which Clark used it. So when the universities that were involved in a study, together with some other universities that recognized themselves in the characteristics that Clark identified, when they got together and decided to form a consortium, there was a discussion about the name. But they felt that the term or the concept of entrepreneurialism didn't describe the way in which they were transforming. They felt that innovative universities that were innovative in the delivery of teaching programs and the development of the content of teaching programs, the way in which they related to society, their leadership, management, administration activities, innovative, so developing new ways of doing old things, and also new ways for doing new things, as they called it, was a much more appropriate way of characterizing in one word these universities than entrepreneurial. Therefore, as a consortium, these universities didn't want to use the term entrepreneurial, but they used the term innovation, innovative universities. Does this make sense?
Peter.
Yes, it does make sense. Thank you.
Peter, can I add something? If when you read the literature by Burton Clark, you see that he articulates somewhere about his contemplation to use the word innovative universities. Because the more origin of this study was that, okay, there have been really challenges higher education institutions have been facing almost globally, shrinking funding, and Burton Clark wanted to study the approaches they were taking to circumvent some of these challenges, such as over-dependence on government funding, for instance. So it is really contemplated in the literature. As Peter said, also he based on this innovative literature. Maybe for some reason, he now decided to use the term entrepreneurial university. There may be some question. I see Mrs. Felicia from Association of African University. Yeah, I think she wrote on the chat. Hello, Felicia, can you ask your question, please? Okay, Peter, we may just continue. I'm not sure. She wrote on the chat, and I don't know if she's still there.
I'm sorry, I think I had muted. Forgive me. Good morning, everyone. So my question really relates to just the previous slide. I think you just clicked on, but the slide that was showing had to do with overcoming the challenges of knowledge and the challenges of knowledge transfer and social engagement. So I was asking that in practical terms, what exactly should the universities be doing? Because they are definitely doing something, but how do we really ensure that they improve on it in terms of, practicality? For instance, there was a mention of the notion of universities being perceived as ivory towers, and also the need that universities need to scale up their social engagement. But we all know, that definitely these are being done, or universities are working towards it, but perhaps it's not really working or yielding the results as we expect. So I really wanted sort of examples to be mentioned, to really bring the terms in a more practical format. What exactly should the universities be doing? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. It's a very important issue. What can universities do? First of all, we see that some universities are successful. So what can we learn from them? In our study, for example, there are universities in Canada and Ontario, which have been rather successful in strengthening knowledge transfer and social engagement and integrating it into the university. So what is being done? First, in the leadership structure, your vice chancellor team or the central leadership team, whether it's rector like in Europe or president or vice chancellor, identify the knowledge transfer, social engagement issues that are of importance in the university and make one person in the central leadership structure responsible. So the universities that are most advanced in this have a vice chancellor or a pro-vice chancellor or a pro-rector or a vice president for social engagement and knowledge transfer. For the third, some call it a pro-vice chancellor for third mission or pro-vice chancellor for societal relations. So that's one. So have the commitment in the central leadership. Then look at the central organization, the support structure. How can you stimulate both social engagement and knowledge transfer in the university? And how can you make sure that the support structure, so the administrators, managers that have the expertise to help academics, staff, and students to develop knowledge transfer and social engagement activities, how can you make sure that they are well embedded and well organized in the central administration? And here we see that many universities have a number of units centrally, one for spin-offs, one for patent issues, one for knowledge or technology transfer, and usually they hardly cooperate or they compete. So make sure that if it's organized in your central administration, that you have a clear office that's responsible for all the aspects of the relationship with society. Then within the academic activities, what is important is that especially social engagement, because knowledge transfer usually comes with funding. There are projects, there are external funders or government is interested, but social engagement, that's much more difficult to fund. But make sure that knowledge transfer activities and social engagement activities of academic staff are rewarded. So that the practice that we see in many universities in Europe, for example, is that if you want to be promoted as an academic staff member of a university, your research productivity is important. Where did you publish? How much external funding do you have, etc. Knowledge transfer activities, social engagement are very rarely included in personnel policies, and staff is not awarded for it. In some universities in our study, we even saw staff being punished for being socially engaged in society. So that's not the way to go. Also students, certainly social engagement activities, students are extremely important, very active. They have, many students have engagement projects or activities or links, but they're very rarely rewarded for it in the form of credit points or other forms of recognition. So overall, I would say central leadership, commitment to knowledge transfer and social engagement, the central administrative structure of the university, the support structure, organize and integrate the support for knowledge transfer and social engagement in an effective way. And then in personnel policies and educational policies of the university, make sure that social engagement and knowledge transfer activities are recognized and are part of the university policy instead of being seen as an add-on, which in many cases lead them to non-recognition or even negative consequences for staff or students involved in these activities. So these are the first kind of feedback that I can give you, and I can go in more detail, but I think for this moment that should suffice. Is this okay? Does this make sense to you?
Yes, excellent, Peter. She's typed excellent, Peter. Excellent response. Maybe I think Peter has just about 3. Oh, it's even finished.
I just want to share with you a last set of slides very briefly, because of an important initiative that I'm involved in together with ARUA, the African Research Universities Alliance, and on behalf of ARUA, Professor Ernest Arietti, a former Vice Chancellor from University of Ghana, Legon, he's involved. And we've looked at the unique window of opportunity now for university collaboration between Africa and Europe. And one activity that's going on is the negotiations between the European Union and the African Union about a new strategic partnership. And in that strategic partnership, both partners, EU and AU, have agreed that at least 20% of the budget and of all the activities should be focused on research and innovation collaboration. So here we come very close already to the entrepreneurial notions. We also know Agenda 2063 with its focus on science, technology, innovation, the African Knowledge Society. Sustainable development goals are important, rapid growth and demand, participation, and ARUA already mentioned as an alliance, the first research university alliance in Africa, with these 16 universities that are together and that have formed a close partnership with the European Alliance of Universities called the Guild of Research Universities. And this paper was launched in July 2020 with a clear proposal for the African Union and the European Union for major investments in African universities and especially their research capacity. So you can download this note, as it is called, concept note, which has been discussed with both the European Union and the African Union from the website of ARUA and the Guild. And in it, you will find proposals for what kind of investments could be made. We focus on 5 areas in natural sciences, life sciences, and social sciences, humanities, and also we argue that investments in Africa, in addition to the many partnerships that exist already, are needed in joint research projects, both Africa and Africa-Europe, master programs, research-oriented doctoral schools with at least 20 PhD students, postdoctoral fellowships to counter brain drain of young African highly talented scholars, appropriate administrative systems, research infrastructure, knowledge transfer. So as said, this agenda and this proposal was developed together with ARUA and is being part of the African-European negotiations now. And what we see already is that the AU and the EU, African and European Union, have agreed on a new program, African Research Initiative for Scientific Excellence. This program will give a scholarship of at least €500,000 to 40 young researchers from Africa who are working at an African university. Build their own research teams. This is a first example of how the Guild ARUA initiative is affecting political decision-making in the European African negotiations about a new partnership. The expectation is that this will develop into a full multi-year program with a much larger budget where many more scholars, also more senior scholars, can profit. But this is an example of how the collaboration between African and European scholars at the moment and university leaders is strengthening with the aim to overall to make sure that African universities can follow the path that is presented in Agenda 2063, and that by 2063 there will be at least 200 strong research universities in Africa that can be equal partners to universities from the rest of the world, not just Europe. So that was briefly about this work that we've done the last 2-3 years. ARUA, the Guild. I'm leading the working group, the North-South working group, as it is called, in the Guild, and we've been organizing this in many ways, and we really hope that this initiative will be followed by more programs that will be part of the new African-European strategic partnership. Finally, here is the setting in which I work at the University of Oslo and in the University of Stellenbosch. And this is one of the books, Knowledge Production, Contradictory Functions in African Higher Education, that can be downloaded for free from the website of Crest and SciStep at the University of Stellenbosch. So thank you very much for your attention. And if there are any final questions, then I'm more than happy to answer them.
While we wait for the question, we just want to plead that before Professor Peter Marson goes, we have the tradition here to take a snapshot. We would open up our videos. The second thing I want to say is the Institute of Development Studies or United Nations called for those who, that today is the last day for those who want to follow the course and the other lectures and the asynchronous course up to the end of the course, which ends in 2 weeks. And this is also an opportunity for me to welcome another special guest that has met us here, Professor Mamu Mutsi, a professor of innovation studies at the University of Cape Town, and in Tshwane University of Technology. Sorry, he is one of the key African scholars of innovation. Actually, also was a student of Christopher Freeman, who brought up the concept of national innovation system as a framework for for economic development. Welcome, Professor Mamu Mutsi. I would like to say he was the opponent of my doctorate, so I was very honored to see him here today. We can go to the photo. Mrs. Felicia, are you taking?
Okay, Prof. Please, can everyone turn on their camera, please?
Okay, good morning, dear. Subject is university entrepreneurial in Africa. You know, here we speak about capacity, talent top, but we have one problem. You know, capacity in corruption, capacity in disaster country. I don't hear very well. Capacity in Africa is nil. Can we have another option? Okay, thank you.
Let's take the picture. Maybe Peter can say something and then we close. We would continue because there are still some questions about entrepreneurial universities. I said we could continue because it's a course. We could continue for the next, usually it's 1 hour, 30 minutes. So we still have 36 minutes to go, but we will continue after Professor Peter Marson leaves.
Dr. Doe, please, some people don't have their videos on.
Please put on your
like
videos.
All of you to turn your videos on and please smile for the cameras.
Please.
Say cheese.
You tell us when it's okay. Professor Ortangs and Dele Rehem.
Bonjour. Hello.
One last one,
okay.
and then we'll be fine. Please smile for the last time, and then we are done. Hello.
Hello.